This is a case that still haunts me to this day. I've seen some terrible things during my time as a police officer, but nothing has ever stayed with me like this. It was my first major case after transferring to the Atlanta Police Department from Charleston, South Carolina. My parents had recently passed away, and I couldn't handle the memories that Charleston held, so I made the move to Atlanta, hoping for a fresh start. I was young, eager to prove myself, and maybe a bit naive. The case begins in the fall of 1987. Back then, local news channel WSB-TV2 had a gap in their Sunday morning programming. They needed something to fill the slot, and after receiving several proposals, they decided to give the time to a young, relatively unknown reverend named Marley Sachs. He was charismatic, well-spoken, and seemed like a safe bet. His show, Words of Light, premiered on October 18th with little fanfare. The show itself was pretty straightforward. Sachs would sit in a simple chair with nothing but a Bible in hand and deliver sermons. He'd read passages, then discuss their relevance to modern life. It was the kind of religious programming you could find anywhere, comforting, predictable, and, frankly, a little boring. The kind of thing you could leave on in the background while you went about your morning routine. At first, it seemed like the show was doing well enough. It wasn't breaking any records, but it had a steady viewership, and Sachs seemed content. But then, in early December, the studio started receiving complaints. These weren't your typical complaints about the content or the reverend's preaching style. No. These were different. Women, only women, were calling in, describing strange symptoms they experienced while watching the show. Nausea, dizziness, blurred vision, and intense back pain. They all reported feeling these things at very specific intervals, about 12 minutes apart, every time they watched Words of Light. The studio staff, understandably concerned, checked the equipment. They found nothing wrong. The video and audio were clean, no static, no interruptions, nothing that could explain the complaints. When Reverend Sachs was informed of these complaints, he didn't seem surprised. He simply shrugged and said, "Some can't handle the voice of God." That cryptic response didn't sit well with the studio head, but there was nothing he could do. The show continued, and so did the complaints. By February, the situation had taken a darker turn. Viewership plummeted. People were talking about it, and not in a good way. It seemed like the show had developed a reputation for making viewers uncomfortable. Around the same time, the city of Atlanta was grappling with a far more pressing concern: the sudden and terrifying rise in miscarriages. It was being called the Atlanta Incident, and by February, over 300 healthy pregnant women had lost their babies. The CDC got involved, and it was all anyone could talk about. No one could figure out what was causing it. The city was on edge. Amid all this, Words of Light was quietly canceled. Sachs didn't protest, didn't argue. He just nodded and walked away. He left the studio after his final episode and disappeared. No one in his congregation heard from him again. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The studio moved on, filling the slot with infomercials, and focused on covering the miscarriage epidemic that had gripped the city. A year and a half later, an intern at WSB-TV was digging through old footage for a piece on religion's impact on Atlanta. He came across the tapes of Reverend Sachs's show and started reviewing them. That's when things took a turn. One day, while trying to stop a recording at 10 minutes and 45 seconds, the intern accidentally jammed the fast-forward button. The tape zipped ahead, finally stopping at 32 minutes and 1 second. When the intern looked up at the screen, he froze. Filling the entire frame was the image of a badly decomposed, severed head. The sight of it was so shocking that the intern actually fell out of his chair. He thought he was seeing things, that maybe it was some trick of the light. But when he rewound the tape and played it again, the image was still there. He went through the tape frame by frame and discovered something even more disturbing. At exactly 12-minute intervals, the image of the severed head would flash on the screen for just a single frame, too fast for the naked eye to catch unless you were looking for it. As the show progressed, the head decayed further, maggots devouring the flesh, chunks of hair and skin peeling away, until it was barely recognizable as human. The intern was understandably shaken. He thought it might be some kind of sick joke played by one of the technicians, But when he brought it to their attention, they were just as baffled. No one had touched the footage since the show was canceled, and there was no sign of tampering. The head of the studio was horrified when he found out. He ordered all the tapes destroyed and told the intern and the technician to keep their mouths shut. The last thing he wanted was a scandal on his hands. The technician was able to move on from the incident, treating it as a strange, darkly funny story to tell at parties. But the intern, he couldn't let it go. He started obsessing over it, trying to piece together what it all meant. He secretly copied as many of the tapes as he could before they were destroyed and began analyzing them. He noticed that when the frames of the severed head were edited together in chronological order, it looked as though the mouth was moving, like it was trying to form words. The intern was convinced there was more to the story. A week later, he reached out to the technician again, trying to rope him into his investigation. The technician, scared for his job, refused to get involved. He told the intern to drop it, to get rid of the tapes and forget about the whole thing. But the intern wouldn't listen. That brings us to the night I got the call. It was early evening, the sun just starting to set, when the dispatcher sent us to a quiet suburban neighborhood. An elderly woman had called 911, saying she heard terrifying screams coming from her neighbor's house. The neighbor was a young couple, and the wife was pregnant. The old woman was frantic, fearing the worst. We arrived at the scene, and something immediately felt off. The house was dark, the front door slightly ajar. My partner and I approached cautiously, our hands on our weapons. As we entered the house, the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. When we got to the living room, it was a scene of pure horror. The young woman, the wife, was lying on the floor, her abdomen slashed open in a jagged, brutal wound. Blood pooled around her, seeping into the carpet. It was clear she was dead. But that wasn't the worst of it. A trail of blood led from her body to the couch, where her husband, the intern from WSB-TV, sat naked, staring blankly at the television. At his feet was the corpse of their unborn child, a tiny, lifeless body that hadn't even had a chance to take its first breath. In the intern's hand was a rusty piece of metal siding, the weapon he had used to butcher his wife and child. The television in front of him was on, but there was no sound. It was playing a loop of silent footage, 18 seconds of that same decomposing head, its mouth moving as if it were trying to speak. The scene was one of the most disturbing things I've ever witnessed. But what chilled me to the bone was what the intern kept saying as we cuffed him and led him out of the house. He was muttering the same phrase over and over, his voice barely above a whisper. "The light of God calls them. The light of God calls them." He repeated it like a mantra, eyes glazed over, completely detached from the reality of what he had done. We later learned that he had been watching the tapes obsessively in the weeks leading up to the murders, growing more and more fixated on the image of the severed head. But there was something else, something that wasn't in the official reports. I did some digging on my own after the case was closed, trying to make sense of what had happened. I found out that Reverend Sachs wasn't just some random preacher looking for a TV slot. He had a history, a dark, twisted history that no one at the studio had bothered to look into. Before coming to Atlanta, Sachs had been involved in a series of religious movements across the South, each one ending in tragedy. In one town, half of his congregation had died in a mysterious fire. In another, several women miscarried after attending his services. He always managed to leave town just before the authorities started asking questions. And then there were these tapes from the studio. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that there was something evil embedded in those recordings, something that went beyond human understanding. The way the intern described the head's mouth moving, like it was trying to speak, it wasn't just random motion. It was deliberate, as if it was trying to communicate something that drove the intern to madness. I've seen a lot of terrible things in my career, but nothing has ever stayed with me like this. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I think about the young woman and her unborn child, and about the intern sitting in that dark room,